Hello and welcome to this video on reviving and using yeast from your favorite beer. Yeast is essential to getting that beer perfect. You can have the right ingredients, ratios and processes, but if the yeast is wrong, it will not come out right. One way to solve this is to order the right strain from a supplier, but some obscure or large industrial beers are just not available, and you need to find a way to emulate or make your own matching yeast. This can be done in one very cheeky way: reviving and rescuing yeast from your beer bottle. This process is not limited to just beer, but cider and other fermented products that still have some live yeast. This is primarily bottled conditioned products. Fortunately, the process is relatively straightforward. Refrigerate your bottle for about a week. This ensures you get a nice solid mass at the bottom. You should use a bottle rather than a can, as the bottle is more likely to have live yeast and avoid any complications from the liners in a can. Then, it also makes the next stage easier: sanitation. Cleaning the outside of the bottle with alcohol, star sand, or something similar will ensure sanitary conditions and give you the most likely chance of getting a relatively pure yeast culture. Pour off the beer from the bottle. This will leave a sedimentary layer at the bottom. This is another convenient reason to use the bottles, as they are generally clear, or at least clear enough that you can see this sedimentary layer. Obviously, the beer is consumed, as you only require that last little bit in the bottom there. Swirl the bottle to combine the sediment with the residual amount of beer in there. This will be your inoculation. Pour it into a new sanitized container. This will ensure that again, you have the best chance of getting a yeast culture and not something unpleasant. Once in there, add about 75 milliliters of wort for a beer yeast. Let it sit for between 24 and 72 hours. No more than 72 hours, or the yeast will run out of nutrition. After this initial period, add another 400 milliliters of wort, or your preferred media such as apple juice or cider. Let this sit for a further 24 to 72 hours. After this, you should have yeast in a 500 milliliter solution. Store this in a fridge for up to a day, which will allow the yeast to settle at the bottom, forming a cake again. This allows you to pour off the media you have been using to grow it, and use the yeast cells that remain and have it, in theory, proliferated as an entirely new culture. After this period of time, you need to figure out whether or not you have actually cultured yeast and the yeast you want. There are two methods to use, and both should be used if possible. The first is to look and see if there is a Crowson. This is otherwise known as a head. This will tell you whether or not the yeast is active. The second is to taste the wort that you've been using as a media in the case of beer. If it tastes like beer, you have had success. This is the simplest approach for a home brewer, but there is a second method that involves agar plates and carefully selecting colonies. For the average home brewer, this has greater risk than trying to run a beer bottle and wort or similar media. It also involves more equipment, time, effort, and knowledge, but it can be done and, in some cases, can be more effective. If you want to increase your odds of getting a good amount of yeast in this initial period to start your culture, ensure that you get beer that hasn't been stored for too long stored in extremely cold conditions, or comes from an extremely alcoholic beverage. All of these make the yeast unhealthy and reduces the chances of you being able to revive it, and even if you do, it increases the probability of mutant strains in the near future. This process overall multiplies whatever is in the bottle. Under good conditions, this will be yeast, and that is about it. The other problem is that some brewers use multiple yeast strains, and you'll not get a pure culture from this. That means that you may have a mess if you try to add it to a new beer. The yeast itself may have one strain that proliferates faster than the other, which means over time you'll get a deviation from the original batch. In bad circumstances, it can multiply the fungus in there that is not yeast, or worse yet, a bacterial contaminant that will outcompete the yeast, leading to, in a kind scenario, food poisoning and having to dispose of large batches of beer. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting or useful, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.